Where did this? You're obviously interested in popular culture. I mean, not quite Hollywood is an indication of it. Where did this start? I mean, can you identify somewhere in your history where you thought, that's what I like? I mean, was it when you first heard Bobby V or?
No, I have no idea. I assume I was just watching cartoons when I was a kid. You know, watching Uncle Croc's Block with Charles Nelson Riley and, you know, Scooby-Doo episodes and all those. They're the things that I guess I really loved when I was a kid. And getting, you know, taken into the city to see Herbie movies. I assume that's the ultimate in pop culture now.
Did you read? I mean, did you read comics?
Yeah, I did.
Or?
I read Mad Magazine. I used to love reading Mad Magazine.
Right.
I used to love Mort Drucker's movie parody. I used to sit there and copy Mort Drucker's drawings of the movie parodies.
Uh-huh.
And I used to love the Don Martin cartoons. And you actually, for a while there was going to be a graphic artist, wanted to be a graphic artist. And I actually went to Swinburne on open day, met with my parents, met with all the graphic arts people there, and then wandered over to the film department. And the minute I walked in there, I knew that's what I wanted to do. And that was kind of, I guess, the moment when I suddenly went, I watched some student films in the theaterette there and went, that's what I want to do. So literally from that point on worked to get into Swinburne.
Had you made films before? I mean, had you handled cameras?
You know, Super 8 films and things like that, but I hadn't made anything of great note. I'd written I was involved in drama at school and I'd written a lot of plays and short sketches and things like that.
There's no Amblin hidden away that
no, there is no Amblin. No, well, unfortunately there isn't. Even my third year Swinburne film, I've never let anyone see because I made a major miscalculation, which I'm sure set me back probably a few years, that I made a third year Swinburne film that wasn't a calling card film, it was a film to bury and not show anyone. So I sort of started from the ground up again when I got out of film school.
So it doesn't exist anymore, you're saying you've destroyed it?
I haven't destroyed it. I've certainly made sure that I've got the only print in existence. And I subsequently cut it down. I stupidly made a 38-minute Swinburne film, which no one in their right mind could sit through. And you can sit through the first 5 minutes, and then you probably, you know, want to pour kerosene into your eyes rather than sit through the rest. And I cut it down to a 1.5-minute trailer for my Swinburne film, which I'm happy to show people. That's where I first met Paul Harris. John Flaus starred in it, and I got Paul in it to do a cameo.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah. 1990.
Right.
Yeah.
Gosh, you are young. You're a young man.
I like to think I'm younger than I am, but I don't think I'm that young anymore.
Well, 1990s, you know, you've basically been making movies for the best part of 20 years.
Yeah, well, that's 20 years in the industry. I'm not that young.
Yeah. Yeah. How did you actually, after you'd been working at Swinburne, how do you step out of Swinburne into the profession?
It's really interesting because I went to film school at the time when I pretty much think that everyone walked out of that school thinking they were a director. They didn't think they were a producer, they didn't think they were a cinematographer. Everyone thought they were an auteur when they walked out of that school. And everyone sat at home waiting for the phone to ring. And I'm the first. I was talking to a couple of people I went to film school with on opening night of MIF, and I think we worked out that I'm the first person in my class at Swinburne to make a feature film. Jacqueline Persk was in my year, and she's obviously written a lot of things. But I think, you know, 20 years on, I'm the first person in my class to actually make a feature, which is pretty sad, really, when you think about it.
Yeah, there are a lot of other people who went through Swinburne, though, who went on
before.
To,
yeah. I think things changed a bit after I left, in terms of, you know, I think there became a much more commercial bent on making films out of Swinburne. I went back and did post-production supervision, the night shift, a few years later, which was the year of Jamie Blanks and those guys, and they were all, you know, making mainstream genre films at Swinburne. And in my year, we were, you know, some of us were and some of us were still making the Swinburne genre films, which were always either coming to terms with life in the urban environment, or gay films, or films about migrants. They always seem to be the three kind of, there's nothing wrong with any of those genres, but they were the three kind of core films that always came out of Swinburne.
I guess when you're working with limited budgets, I mean, you've got to be operating at street level. You can't go big.
Well, I don't think it's that. I think it's people go to film schools to tell the stories that they want to tell, and some people want to tell more personal stories than others. And I never felt that I wanted to tell a personal story at film school, and a lot of people did. Nothing wrong with that.
How do you step though from, you graduate from Swinburne, and you don't sit around and wait for the phone call that's not going to come?
Straight out of film school, I worked for Tramfare as an assistant editor on Strictly Ballroom for Jill Bilcock.
Right.
So I went and did that for a month or so, and then while I was doing that, I'd won the Edit Award at Swinburne for cutting a film, and Mike Reed's post-production rang up, and they needed the next assistant on the assembly line to go and work there for basically next to no money. So I said, I'm sorry, I'm working for nothing on something already. Finished the work on Strictly, which at that point was, it was being finished on the smell of an oily rag. And then went and worked at Mike Reed's, where I started off as an assistant editor, just as a lackey working for the main editors, cutting, who were working on cutting clips and film trailers and a lot of television commercials. And I had also shot some music videos while I was at film school or while I was even before that, while I was at Huntingdale Tech. I went to Huntingdale for a year because I've heard that was the school that every student went to that subsequently got into film school. Graham Wood and people like that had gone there. So while I was at Huntingdale Tech, I made some clips, and I just continued doing that using the resources of Mike Reed's. And while I was at Mike Reed's, I got to cut for a company called City Films, which was run by Paul Goldman and Craig Griffin. And I pretty much became an exclusive editor for them. And after a couple of years at Mike Reed's, they said, why don't you come and cut for us? We can actually pay you good money, and you can also direct through us as well, because I was directing low budget clips. So I did that, joined City Films, cut all Paul's clips, which were pretty big, Jimmy Barnes, Johnny Diesel, John Farnham clips, and gradually worked myself up the directing food chain doing music videos, and subsequently ended up directing about 150 of them. And
we're talking about the best part of 20 years work here.
We're talking about I had a good 15 years making music videos, yeah. So, I started off doing really low budget clips and ended up, doing as big as they came in this country and, getting overseas budgets. And I had, actually, when I was at Brisbane the other day, a guy came to me and said, "You're Mark Hartley, you made all these clips that I used to watch when I was a kid." And that's when I suddenly felt old, Tom. And he's now, the young gun music video director. And the budgets that I had, I must have just rode the final wave of decent budgets in clips. I had to sell out to get them. I started off doing clips for bands like, Powderfinger, Living End, Cruel Sea, Tex Perkins, and sold out and did the Human Natures and the Sophie Monks and the Nikki Websters and the pop star stuff. But doing that, I got decent budgets, got to work with real crews, and got to experiment and play with a lot of toys that I wouldn't have got working on the clips of only bands that I liked.
Just on that, when you're directing a video clip, because people don't talk to filmmakers about the video clips they do. My question is, to what extent do you control the finished product? I mean, there's obviously no general rule, but kind of in your experience, to what extent do you control the finished product, and to what extent is it the artist or the management who are looking over your shoulder all the time saying, this is what we want, no, and exercising their prerogative?
Ultimately, you have to pitch on a project. So you come up with the idea for the clip anyway, and they get pitches from, say, 10 different directors, and they go with the one that they like. So automatically, they've chosen you because they like your idea. So I found that the bigger the artist was, the more control you had. The smaller the artist was, the more control they wanted. I found it was interesting. There was always, when you were dealing with smaller bands, there was always a member of the band that wanted to be a filmmaker or was a graphic artist or something who had a vision for the band. But ultimately, as you got to work with the bigger acts, they trusted you because making clips was a chore for them. They didn't want to do them. They were forced to do them. And if they could turn up and there was someone who just could tell them what to do, and they knew that ultimately we'd get on TV, they were happy. And I fell into a good niche. I wasn't making art, and I never thought that I was making art. I was making clips that were there to be shown on the mainstream television shows and sell records. And subsequent to that, we had a lot of fun on the clips. Artists kept on working with me because it wasn't a chore. They had a lot of fun. There was no kind of hierarchy on set. It was very irreverent on set. We could take input from everyone. It was a very kind of, it was a really creative time on set. And the record companies were happy that the clips were polished enough. I did glossy clips. I made my own ring light that made all the artists look good. They got on video hits on Saturday mornings. As long as that happened, record companies left you alone. And I had a lot of freedom because I made more mainstream clips. I know a lot of people who wanted to make more out there clips had a lot of problems with record companies because the record companies didn't understand them and they didn't think that they were right for their artist. So I had a pretty dream run when it came to clips. And I always knew in the back of my mind that I was making a selling tool, a commercial for the band, and that's what I had to do. So I had a lot of fun, and I really miss doing them, to tell you the truth.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Alongside that interest...
Can I just say, the other thing about clips that no one realises, clips are kind of perceived as the lowest kind of rung of filmmaking, I think. They're even seen lower than advertising, I'm sure. Advertising people look down on clip makers.
Yeah, really? I mean, from outside I'm not aware of
We never had the budgets of ads. But it was great because you could do so many different things in clips. You could do... I was playing with blue screen, I was doing CGI, I was doing... Every clip I did was pretty much different, and you could... So long as your wild ideas fitted into a format that got on television, you could do whatever you want. So as a filmmaker, it was an amazing creative time because you never had to do the same thing twice. And I don't think that happens in any other medium.
Yeah. My next question might kind of illustrate your point, but about the way in which the bottom rung of the ladder is the video clip. But were you kind of looking beyond the video clip at that point? Were you looking for a particular kind of, leg into the industry?
Well, it was interesting. When I always wanted to make feature films. When we were at Swinburne, we all said, we're all going to make a film before we're 30. That was our aim. That was the only goal we set ourselves. We're going to make a feature film before we're 30. That didn't happen. But when I was doing clips, I did a clip which was a remake of Don's Party for UMI. And I had Ben Mendelsohn and Matt Day and Nadine Garner and Stephen Curry playing the Graham Kennedy role long before The King. So I was always trying to work with actors, and they were testing of me too, particularly Ben, was going, this clip maker, I'm going to put him through the paces. And after half an hour, thankfully, he kind of realised that I knew what I was doing and left me alone. Yeah. But so I always tried to do that stuff, knowing that I wanted to springboard that into feature films. What I subsequently discovered in Australia, unlike any other country in the world, clip makers can move on and do features in any other country in the world, but because our budgets weren't that big in Australia, we couldn't really put narratives in our clips that made people believe that we could launch into feature films. Well, I found that anyway. Yeah. And it's interesting that people like Russell Mulcahy and that, none of those, Chris Lefane too. Chris Lefane made a lot of clips. He made Oz early on, but never got to make another feature. Paul Goldman had to go and make a lot of ads and had to go to Sydney and had to reinvent himself as a Sydney director before he could get a feature up. He certainly couldn't get one up in Melbourne. Richard Lowenstein was lucky, but Richard kind of got his features up on the back of, obviously Strikebound got up on the back of his student film, his Swinburne film, Evictions. So I think it's been very difficult to cross over from music videos into anything other than advertising.
Do you feel you've crossed over now? I mean, do you feel you've stepped over with not quite Hollywood?
I've made a documentary. I'm sure it's probably just as difficult to go from being perceived as a documentary filmmaker into a narrative filmmaker. Yeah. But I think the good thing is that people are seeing in Not Quite Hollywood that there's a bit of energy there, there's some kind of storytelling. And now there's some talk of striking while the iron's hot to get the guy who's made the Bible on Australian genre films to actually make a genre film, and they can see that that's good marketing somewhere along the line. So if I ever get to make a feature film, it'll have to be very quick.
Who's they?
Oh, various producers who suddenly have found my telephone number after all these years.
Now, alongside, I still want to look at your history for a while longer. Alongside this concern with, the hands-on exercise, there's the exercising of the mind in a different way, in a critical way, where you are an avid film viewer. a regular on Film Buff's forecast. You've done DVD commentaries on the various Australian films that you're.
I've made I don't know if I've done any commentaries, but I've certainly made featurettes on lots of them.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. To what extent is this fueling your drive, and are there any particular films and kinds of films that are fueling your drive to actually make that first feature that comes from the stuff that you're watching?
Well, it's interesting. This is not quite Hollywood. Is certainly not indicative of the first feature that I would have liked to have made. We had a project called The Driving Kids first up, which got shortlisted for the Commercial Television Fund, which was a rollicking kids film. I really liked films like The Sandlot Kids and stuff like that. And this was kind of an Australian version of that. We almost got that up, and it was out of us and a film called Hurrah to get funded. And Frank Shields' Hurrah got funded instead of us. Have you ever seen Frank Shields' Hurrah?
No, I haven't.
Join the club. And so we didn't get that up. And then we had a project called The King of Pop, which was going to get funded by Roadshow when Alan Finney was there. And we had Eric Bana, John Clark, Sophie Monk, Marcus Graham attached. And it was kind of like an Elmore Leonard style Australian crime thriller, but set in the music industry and the music video industry, which made perfect sense for people and how I fitted into that. Because people kept on saying, you make music videos, how does that relate to making a kids film? So we said, okay, we're going to make a film that people will understand. And then Alan left Roadshow. The new regime didn't want anything to do with what Alan had liked, and that subsequently didn't get up. And if it had got up, it would have come right on the tail end of Chopper and probably would have done very well. And then after that, we wrote a teen movie called Go on Bush, which we had Sophie Monk attached to. That was, almost up for a little while. And so the projects have all been kind of genre-based, but they haven't been of the horror or the action or the sexploitation genre base at all. So, but while I was doing that, I certainly I really admired certain genre films. And going back to my childhood, I had grown up seeing things like Snapshot and Patrick and Man from Hong Kong on TV. And I guess what I liked about them, what appealed them to me, was the fact that at least Patrick and Snapshot were shot in Melbourne, and I could see familiar locations. And they seemed like American films to me, but they had these Australian locations and Australian accents. And that's what I found really intriguing about them, and that was my connection to them, I think. And I'd seen, as a kid, I'd been taken along to see Picnic at Hanging Rock and those films. But these films, because they played, I guess, like mainstream commercial American films, there was something special about them as an Australian watching them as a kid. And subsequently, when I was at Haileybury, I found that Richard Franklin had been a student there, so I invited him to come and talk, and had to introduce him to the school. This is the same year that he'd done Psycho 2, so I must have been 13 or 14. And we didn't have cinema papers in our library, but we had some books on Australian films, and I looked up Richard's films, and they were, if I can't remember exactly, but I'm sure if they got any mention at all, it would have been a footnote.
Yes.
And that's kind of when I realised, well, it's not when I realised, but it's when I first obviously saw that there was a whole history of Australian film, good or bad, that hadn't been documented. And when I stayed in touch with Richard, and Richard was very, very supportive of the project. And when I worked on, Richard actually wrote a letter for me to get into Swinburne as well.
One of the things that's kind of forgotten when you're looking at the films is the role that people like Richard played, certainly in Melbourne and perhaps beyond. I remember inviting him to talk at Coburg State College when I was lecturing there, and Richard came along, and he was a fabulous performer. And he wore white shoes, and you could see the impact that he had. I mean, he told these terrific stories.
He was an anecdote
Brian
machine.
De Palma, absolutely. And gradually, over the course of the year, a number of the male students took to wearing white shoes. So he left his mark wherever he went.
Well, I must admit, I never owned a pair of white shoes, so obviously.
Maybe he didn't wear them when he.
When I first met Richard, he had a penchant for wearing canary yellow jumpers. If you remember that stage?
Yes.
And I never bought one of those either. But he was really inspirational, Richard, because he told these amazing stories. And as a kid who was at Haileybury, and Jamie Blanks tells the same story because he was there a couple of years after me in my brother's year. You know, Richard was a guy, you were at Haileybury, which was a school that was very focused on academic and sporting achievements. There was, you know, I had a fantastic art teacher called Graham Bennett, who'd worked with John Truscott and won an Oscar with him. So Graham was a really inspirational too, but Richard came along, and Richard was there. He's a guy who'd gone to the same school as us, and he was working in Hollywood. You know, it all gave us faith that, you know, not that anyone could do it, but that maybe there was a chance that, you know, and you know, in some small way it came true for me when we ended up shooting the interviews for Not Quite Hollywood at the old Desilu studios in America. So we were shooting on the same stages where they were shooting, you know, Star Trek and Mission Impossible.
See, I wonder to what extent your career trajectory is like somebody like Richard, and to what extent it's operating independently.
Well, look, I have to say the annoying thing for us is when we read about these guys, they were making their first feature at 21.
Yeah.
They made 4 features by the time they were 26.
Well, Richard was older. I mean, he had worked locally, but it was, I mean, I think
he was
Richard's
directing Homicides when he was
that's
19
true.
or something.
Yes, yeah.
You know, I think he was, what, 22 or 23 when he made Eskimo Now.
But Richard was a film buff.
Yeah.
Richard would you know, had prints of John Ford,
Yeah.
Alfred Hitchcock, and he would immerse himself in those. I mean, he knew them shot by shot.
Yeah.
Are you like that, you know, with particular movies?
My memory's kind of fading a bit now, but I was. I used to just devour films, and I've still got every book I've ever bought on films. I've still got, you know, got a room full of VHS tapes that I keep on thinking I should throw out.
You can transfer those to DVD.
I know, but
you know,
it's just that it's a time-consuming.
Yeah.
I keep on going through them and going, I'll make a short list of the ones to transfer first, and every tape I've pulled out is, you know, not in quite as good nick. Look, actually, the thing that I've learnt is that as soon as you transfer a film off your VHS tape to DVD, the next month it gets released legitimately on DVD. It's happened every time. So I think my transferring of films to DVD is somehow wired into the release pattern in America.
Yeah. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Tom.